Really good to see you here this morning. A very, very warm welcome from the Guild of St George, who are putting on this event today, and a very warm welcome also from Two Temple Place, who've provided the fantastic venue that we're in today. And we're doing this thing. We're going to be obviously listening, talking, hopefully taking part in questions and discussing together. But in the times when we're not doing that, we do have the opportunity to look around. So there's been some space before we started. There will be at lunchtime. We have an hour for lunch. The intention being there is the opportunity to look around. So please do. And then at the end of the day as well, there will also be time. So again, a very warm welcome. May I just ask a question or two? Can I just ask you, how many people have heard of Ruskin before they came into the building today? Okay. So I'm really pleased because some people haven't, which is actually really helpful. So we're doing something today that is discussing, searching for Ruskin's Utopia. There are a few people here who, in a sense, might have a bit of a map. They've got the map already in their own experience, perhaps, and they're going to be talking to us and describing a little bit about Ruskin and economic justice, Ruskin and the environment, and then finally Ruskin and the place in the arts. But those are really just hooks for us to hang our discussion on, because the problem with Ruskin is he just went all over the place. Everywhere you could have an opinion, he had an opinion. So we can't really limit ourselves to those three things, and I'm sure we'll find as we go along that we will have to divert to other interesting things. And I really encourage you and invite you, please, to take part in what we're doing today. So yes, there will be some talking from the front, inevitably, hopefully to stir your imagination and your interest, but very much we're hoping that you will feel able to discuss, to ask, to bring questions, and to debate together. That's the aim of this day here. What else should I say? We have got the rough timetable I've just given you. We do break for lunch at 12:30 or thereabouts. There will be space to do that. The facilities are all downstairs. If the fire alarm goes off, it's probably because there's a fire. So we'll all run away downstairs and they'll show us where to go or something like that. I think that's what we're supposed to say at that moment. And I think that's it for the introductions. Oh, sorry, Rachel. Thank you very much. That's the little commercial slot. Very good, Rachel. And yes, so that's excellent. Also, an apology, very swiftly. We do have a lovely booklet that introduces people to the Guild of St George, because you may not have come across the Guild of St George before. Unfortunately, the 3,500 copies that we printed have all gone for the event here, because it's been so popular. So our apologies for that. What we're giving you, not instead, but also will pique your interest, is a programme of what we're up to in Sheffield. The wonderful Ruth here, sitting on the second row, has been responsible for this programme, and it gives you a flavour and a feel of the sort of things that the Guild is up to today, not just as a historical body. But there we are. Look, I'm getting into the talking already, and that's no good. I'll hand over to more of a professional, which is Clive Wilmer, who's the master of the Guild of St George, to give you the introduction. So over to you, Clive.
Chris? Water. Water.
Don't mind me.
Can I take a glass? Thanks a lot. Great. Well, good morning, everybody, and can everybody hear me, by the way? Yeah. Welcome to this symposium. In 1871, Ruskin began writing a series of open letters to what he called the workmen and labourers of Great Britain. And in an early letter, he announced the foundation of a new institution, which was to be the Guild of St George. And he announced it with these words: "I have listened to many ingenious persons who say we are better off now than ever we were before. I do not know how well off we were before, but I know positively that many deserving persons have great difficulty in living in these improved circumstances. For my own part, I will put up with this state of things not a moment longer. And he announced his intention to found an organisation which set up, as it were, an alternative kind of society. So the Guild was, from its origins, utopian. And I want, in the next few minutes, to try and explain how I understand the word utopian in Ruskin's terms, because I don't think it's always entirely obvious. But I think the Guild's work today, which is rather different in some ways from what it was then, needs to be understood in that context. The Guild has, rather surprisingly, survived for over a century. We're just about to be 150 in 2021. And its purpose is to try and make our country, and possibly the world, a better place to live in. Not by large-scale ambitious schemes, but by doing things properly, which are good examples to all. And part of the point of this exhibition, this wonderful exhibition, I think, which you see around you, is that we want to show what the Guild has to a larger audience. Its purpose was to be seen by the people of Sheffield, particularly the craftspeople of Sheffield who worked there. And Ruskin always worked at a local level. But periodically, it's useful to put such a thing on general display and make it clear to the world what we do and why we do it. Ruskin considered that what he was doing was building up national wealth. Wealth is a word that he uses a great deal in his writings. Probably the most famous thing he ever said is the great aphorism from Unto This Last, "There is no wealth but life." A justifiably famous comment, I think, and one which, the more you think about it, becomes ever more profound. But it's quoted so often out of context that I'd like to just remind us what part of the context is. He goes on, "There is no wealth but life, life including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. That country is the richest, which nourishes the greatest number of noble and happy human beings." To us today, the word admiration may seem a little pallid. Ruskin was almost certainly thinking of a line from Wordsworth, "We live in admiration, hope, and love." So admiration is on a level with hope and love. And I think it means something like what we would mean by the word wonder, which is the word we're using for this exhibition when it moves to Sheffield at the end of this run here in London. It will be called John Ruskin Art and Wonder. We wonder at the world, at the beauty of things. And you see in these pictures around you evidences of such wonder. Ruskin was a great enthusiast for the developments going on in science in his day. But he had an anxiety about science. His anxiety was that science encourages us to be neutral in the face of nature. Ruskin thought that what we feel about nature is a fundamental part of our understanding of it, and that to deny that feeling is to falsify what it is. God, Ruskin was a devout religious believer, God made nature for us to enjoy, to make us happy. And that brings me to the second part of what he was saying, that that country is richest, which has the greatest number of noble and happy human beings. Noble means of spiritual refinement, I suppose. But the word that interests me there is the word happy. It's such a simple word, but it's the basis of everything Ruskin did. He wanted us to be happy. And he spent large amounts of his money on doing things which he thought would make people happy. He thought that life was created for us to enjoy, fundamentally, to enjoy and maybe to learn from. And he was faced with the obvious fact that looking around him, there didn't seem to be all that many happy people to be found. He was thinking of these things, of course, at the time of mass industrialization. And in a city like Sheffield, for which this collection was created, such industrialization had done enormous damage to a dramatically beautiful landscape, and more alarmingly to the health and well-being of a great many human beings. And so Ruskin's purpose was to bring happiness in all the different ways that he could. Most particularly, I think, Ruskin anticipated the great William Morris in arguing that the thing we most obviously need to be happy in is our work. Yes, it's okay to be happy when you play, when you are doing the things which are obviously relaxing. But if you're miserable while you work, you're made miserable by the very thing that enables you to live and which occupies most of your time. Ruskin's great visionary essay, The Nature of Gothic, is about, fundamentally, the pleasure of work. That looking at the great Gothic cathedrals and the great Gothic buildings of medieval Europe, one sees the pleasure taken by the artists and the craftsmen in the work that they did. And Ruskin contrasts that with the work he sees in a modern sitting room where everything is finished to perfection to satisfy the comfort and luxury of the privileged few. Such perfection, Ruskin argued, was a form of enslavement. It brought misery to the workman who had to submit himself to a prescription not of his choosing and to kill the force of his own imagination. Ruskin wanted to free the imagination. And so, when we talk about utopia, let's just for a minute think that we're not actually talking about perfection. Utopia obviously can mean that. It can mean creating the perfect society. But I don't think that's what Ruskin was talking about at all. He was talking about a process, a way of living that was better and would get better than what we had. Quite early on in his career, Ruskin says this in a lecture on architecture, talking about the word utopian, which comes up in the course of the lecture. He says, "I believe the quiet admission which we all of us are so ready to make, that because things have been wrong, it is impossible they should ever be right, is one of the most fatal sources of misery and crime from which the world suffers." That's possibly a little obscure. He's saying that giving up hope because things are bad, that they can never be good again, is fatal to any sort of development and progress. Whenever you hear a man dissuading you from attempting to do well on the ground that perfection is, quotes, utopian, beware of that man. Cast the word out of your dictionary altogether. There is no need for it. Things are either possible or impossible. You can easily determine which in any given state of human science. So the Guild of St. George, which Ruskin founded, exists to do what is possible, especially when its work includes that supposedly difficult thing, ordinary happiness. Ruskin is very specific about wanting to make our country a happier place. But I think it's important to get his meaning exactly right. He wasn't proposing anything as abstract as an ideal society, nor was he setting out a political philosophy or program, nor was he talking about achievable perfection. Quite the opposite. In The Nature of Gothic, for example, he roundly condemns the requirement that a craftsman's work should be perfect. It's a great paradox. Only the craftsman who knows perfection to be beyond his grasp ever comes near to achieving it. I want to tell you an amusing story. A few years ago, a student I was teaching read The Nature of Gothic, and I asked him afterwards what Ruskin meant by perfection. And he said this. He said, "It's like the difference between wine and Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is perfect. Anywhere you will happen to be in the world at any time of the day or week, you can go and get a bottle of Coca-Cola and it will always have exactly the same effect. And once you have had that effect, you forget about it until next time. If you have the finest wine available to you, you always know that somewhere or other there is a better bottle. Therefore, the bottle of wine that you're having with tremendous pleasure is imperfect. And it's the variety of wine that brings it its special status in our culture and feelings. And that sort of variety, the sense that no two things are the same, is fundamental to Ruskin's idea of what is good in the world. In an essay called The Law of Help, for instance, he talks about the leaves on a tree and how all the leaves on a single branch are recognizably of the same kind, of course, and yet every leaf is different from all the other leaves. And the same, of course, applies to human beings, which is why the imagination and inventiveness of individual human beings need to be exploited. So that is what we do in the Guild today, is we try to live according to those principles. And I look around this room and I see several of my colleagues here who work in different parts of the Guild's domain in an attempt to try and bring something better to the world in a particular place and to particular people. And those activities and that work becomes by those means exemplary. We do not make a stir in the world, but we hope that we make some effect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clive. Really helpful to set the scene for us this morning. Talking of setting the scene, I want to now move us on to the next session. We're going to be looking at economic justice, and Andrew Hill of the FT, he's obviously got the morning off to be with us today, which is really helpful. He's going to be talking on that subject. And just by way of introduction, I wanted to mention a couple of things, partly because my day job, I'm an accountant, I work for an accountancy firm. Economic justice is something that I get involved in a lot. I work mostly with non-profits, with charities and the like, trying to help them with their money. Not because money is the main thing, but actually it is something that if you're not careful will master you rather than you master it. And one wonders, perhaps in a place like this, talking about Ruskin, you know, the first thing you think about with Ruskin is art, and we're surrounded by it, fantastic things. You know, we're normally able to talk about art with Ruskin. We may be able to talk about environment with Ruskin. We are going to do that very thing later on with Chris, and that will be fantastic. But what about Ruskin and Money? Now, Ruskin and Money had a tricky history, really, because when he decided he was going to publish on the subject, he got absolutely shouted down. He was like, "What are you doing?" they said. "Why do you mess with something you don't understand?" but actually his whole view of the world, his whole view of our place in it, I think, in a sense, can be expressed through the lens of economic justice. And that's why we're starting off with that today. I said earlier on, we can't just look at Ruskin through one set of eyes. This will mix all the way through. But I wanted to start here, really, because I'm sure you've heard the saying before, the last bit of a person that gets converted, if they decide they want to follow a particular faith, is their wallet. They always say that, don't they? And I think that's actually a general truth for all of us. We can dabble in things, we can agree with things, but what if we actually had to pay for something? Oh my goodness, then that really affects what's going on. And at the beginning of the Guild of St. George, Ruskin asked people to join and to pay. They had to pay a tithe, a bit like being in a church. That was part of the arrangement, part of the plan there. Not everybody was happy with this idea. We don't ask it today, by the way, just in case you're asking. We haven't continued that particular theme through. But I think, in a sense, Ruskin had something there. If basically we can have great ideas, but if they don't really affect your pocket, the way you actually live, then are they really meaningful? So we're going to start off with that idea, I think. I'm sure Andrew will guide us through plenty of other things too, but I wanted to start at that particular point to help us as we go through the rest of the day. So without further ado, Andrew, would you like to come and lead us on into the next section? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be back here. This is my fourth visit to this exhibition and various different events. I was here just under a week ago leading a works outing, I suppose that's the best way to describe it, of colleagues from the Financial Times who invited me to give them a little bit of a guided tour of the exhibition as part of a programme that my immediate boss at the FT is organising to try and encourage and stimulate a bit of creativity on the part of colleagues, some different thinking, which is a very Ruskinian idea, and I was very happy to take part in that. Thank you too to Clive and to Chris for the warm-up. The point about utopias that Clive picked on is something I've picked on right on the back of my book, Ruskin Land. He, as Clive said, advised people to cut the word utopian out of their dictionary altogether and said things are either possible or impossible. If the thing's impossible, you need not trouble yourselves about it. If possible, try for it. And as Clive has richly laid out, the Guild of St. George is active and remains full of possibility, as I've written in the book. And when it comes to the strange economics of John Ruskin, I'd argue that we're really talking about things that go well beyond what John Ruskin himself might have envisaged as the utopian future, even if the Guild and the work it does still cleaves to that basic aim that Clive's laid out about making the world a happier place. So my day job is writing about management, and let's give you a little picture of Ruskin to keep you company during this. The word happiness is not a word that is heard very much in the management literature. There is a strain of the work that I read from my day-to-day work in business books about happiness, but it is not a common word. And one of the strange things to me is that in Ruskin's work, it's arguably more common than it is now when we are, or ought to be, more advanced than in Ruskin's day. He used the word happiness a lot. In Stones of Venice, for example, he talked about the evils of modern manufacturing and said that they could be combated only by a right understanding on the part of all classes of what kinds of labour are good for men, raising them and making them happy. And then there's Ruskin's great ambition when he was teaching artisans how to draw at the Working Men's College in the 1850s. His efforts, he explained later, were directed not to making a carpenter an artist, but to making him happier as a carpenter. So just a little bit about my path to Ruskin and how this leads to the ideas on economic justice. I knew a bit about Ruskin. We have a house in the Lake District. I studied some art history at school, but I really was revived and pushed down the particular path of Ruskin and his economics, if you like, when I picked up a copy of Unto This Last at Brantwood around 10 years ago, when we were in the middle of the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, arguably where we are still suffering in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I noticed in this book, which was obviously Ruskin's great shout against the evils and evil consequences of industrial capitalism and orthodox economics, political economy as he called it, a lot of parallels with what we were talking about then and indeed are still talking about now. So inequality, the social uselessness of some forms of work, in particular in banking and finance, the excesses of executive pay, the way in which chief executives had abandoned their duty as what Ruskin would have called honest merchants, so the ethics of leadership, and as Clive has mentioned, the uses of wealth and the production of its toxic opposite, which he called ilth, still a word that I think deserves to be revived. But what I've come to think since, and this is what I want to concentrate in this first part of the next few minutes, and then afterwards open to discussion, I hope, what I think has become more prescient and useful and influential as part of Ruskin's ideas is his conviction that work was worthless and even dangerous unless it was imbued with meaning and purpose. And as I mentioned, I don't think much has improved since the 19th century when he recognized that workers were generally unhappy. There was a Gallup poll in 2016 which showed that only 13% of employees were engaged at work. So we're not even talking about the slightly higher bar of happiness, we're talking about feeling engaged with work. So 87% of workers are disengaged. And this is where I think the Guild, and we're talking here about the way in which, among other things, the Guild can set a tone for the rest of the 21st century, where I think the Guild could act as an important lever for change and for economic justice in this century, drawing strength from the fact that others are already moving in that direction. So Ruskin obviously believed that workers required sufficient education to use their human capabilities, but also sufficient room in which to exercise the way they worked. And this has an echo in a recent paper that John Hagel, who's a thinker who works for Deloitte in Silicon Valley, has written. He writes in this paper how of the importance of giving frontline workers the time and space to uncover the unseen opportunities and problems for their relevant constituents and the latitude to act upon them. And I've also heard something recently similar from Zeynep Ton. This is Zeynep Ton, who works at MIT Sloan School of Management in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She's set up something called the Good Jobs Institute to promote an idea she wrote about in her 2014 book, The Good Jobs Strategy. It's mainly aimed at service workers, particularly those in retail, in shops, and particularly those in bricks and mortar stores. And she proposes a way of avoiding a descent into a vicious cycle in which lower sales prompt store managers to cut labor. That triggers operational problems, which further reduces sales and then leads to more cuts and so on. And of course, particularly now, algorithmic management of such store workers using the computer programs that measure their productivity lead to a sort of just-in-time scheduling of workers. And in this country, that's exacerbated by 0 hours contracts and other methods. One of her principles is that stores need to schedule slack into the system so that staff can perform better, engage more with customers, and come up with new ideas and innovations, in short, so that they should be happier. I've also visited in the last couple of years Michelin in France. This is a still, if you like, from inevitably being France. They have a bande dessinée, a cartoon strip that shows what they're doing at Michelin. They call it responsabilisation, which I guess translates as something between accountability and empowerment. In this one, the workers are saying that in their new liberated state, that's the end of I command, you obey. And indeed, they've introduced a method of managing the workforce that is more like sort of independence in a strategic framework, as their chief executive calls it. It involves line managers stepping back from the teams that they used to exercise command and control over and acting more as coaches while the frontline workers take the decisions. And I visited Le Puy in the Auvergne, which is one of the pilot plants for this initiative now being rolled out elsewhere in Michelin, and talked to some of the workers who are obviously more independent, they're more flexible, and they say that they are happier using more of their imagination and flexibility to create the schedules that suit them and suit the enterprise. So this is often talked about as kind of a revolutionary way of improving work, but I think it is more the exercise of common sense and common wisdom in which Ruskin played a part. And it's no coincidence, for example, that the Michelin program, Zeynep Ton's Good Work, Good Jobs strategy, and John Hagel's redefinition of work all draw on something that Toyota of Japan was already doing with its famous lean production system. Lean production's come to be associated with a sort of soul-destroying attempts to increase productivity and efficiency. But in fact, when it was first introduced, it had a very clear human objective to hand independence to the front line and to delegate to the front line the task of solving problems and improving the system. It was actually American imitators who stripped it of that and turned it into a tool for restructuring and layoffs. So this is where I think it gets interesting, because when Ruskin wrote Unto This Last, he was railing against a form of automation and mechanization that we now see as computers come into the workplace. And he spoke about how rich, in every sense, Britain would be if it aimed instead to manufacture souls of good quality. Now, as we know, he didn't like technology much. His emphasis was very much on the rural economy, but I think the type of machines that he abhorred are now potentially part of the key to realizing some of the ambitions to give a bit more freedom to workers and to create more meaningful work by freeing up time and capacity for staff to be more fulfilled, happier, and as a byproduct, more productive. This is an image from the website of Unto This Last, which is a workshop in East London. It's located in Brick Lane in an old Victorian pub. And when I visited, it really did remind me on a tiny scale of some of the production lines, the uncluttered production lines of big car makers like Toyota and others, with machines working alongside the staff. And Toyota is, in fact, an inspiration for Unto This Last founder, Olivier Geoffroy, another companion of the Guild. He employs a production manager at Unto This Last whose job description includes the duty to make everybody's job interesting. And this isn't just about nostalgia. This isn't harking back to Ruskin as a way of saying we must apply Ruskinian principles as a whole. Instead, it's part of a sort of quest to use everything available, including machine technology and the creative imaginations of the members of staff to become more productive. He asks every week they gather to determine, what problems can we solve? How can we make this workbench less cluttered? How can we produce something with less noise or less dust? And they apply those imaginative leaps to make the business better. Technology is pretty crucial to this. As you can see, they're working with a system of actually unemployed robots, second-hand robots, which they buy in. And Olivier Geoffroy makes clear that this isn't to do with scaling up. This isn't to do with creating the biggest furniture workshop on the planet, but in fact to sort of scale down. He told me one of the logics of this process is to reduce the workshop to something smaller, to reduce the size of the material that they handle, and to do things with less, which he sees as a very logical and human part of Ruskin's legacy and work. So my feeling is that we are sort of standing at a point where, as these sorts of small-scale experiments show, and indeed Olivier is engaged in a project with some government funding to try and pepper the country with these types of urban workshops. Small scale, he delivers, for example, by bicycle within range of the workshop, but which can be spun out into different communities, very rooted in the community, again, something that Ruskin would have admired. I think we could use technology in a way to play to our human strengths at work, and we could actually divert away from making some of the mistakes that Ruskin saw big owners of factories in the 19th century making as they scrambled to make the most of new technologies available to them. So obviously, many of these solutions will need to be new because we're working in a different era. Our situation is different. But I think a lot of them could be remade from the things that we've understood from what Ruskin and other commentators in their time in the Victorian era saw as ways of advancing and making the work happier and more fulfilling. And by seeking this out, this meaning in our work, and giving ourselves the time and the space to use our human capabilities, I think we can unleash new opportunities and perhaps transform ourselves and our colleagues into productive, happy carpenters. So this, it seems to me, is an area where the Guild could focus its utopian ambition today, to use Ruskin's motto. We may take it for granted that we have work. Indeed, employment in this country is increasing. And we may take it for granted that it's fulfilling. Now, the first of those is obviously not always given. I visited the Working Men's College, which is now in Camden, for the book, to do some of the research for the book. It's obviously restyled itself as the WMC now, and part of the reason for that is that 75% of the learners at the WMC are now women. And much of the effort that educators, the heirs, if you like, of Ruskin and others who taught there when it was launched, much of their effort is lifting people just onto the first rung of the working ladder, so teaching them English as a second language or basic essential math skills that get them into the basic jobs that will help them advance. Yet it still really has the capacity, the WMC and other further education institutes, to launch students down new paths, just as Ruskin launched, for example, Henry Swan, who became the first eccentric curator of the Sheffield, of the Walkley collection, was a student of his. He was launched down a new path. Or George Allen, who became Ruskin's publisher in Allen and Unwin. The WMC still has a prize called the How WMC Changed My Life prize, in which they ask students to answer that question. I'll just read a little bit about that. So one woman, so it's awarded to the student with the most vivid story of transformation. So one woman who moved to London from Chennai in India in 2016 wrote that without the WMC's English language courses, she would not have dared to register for a yoga teacher training program. Another student fought through periods of homelessness, disease, and trauma before a WMC creative writing course unlocked my mind. A third, a grandmother and full-time night support worker in a care home, aims to use her English and maths tuition at the college to run her own nursery school and write children's stories. Her tutors, she wrote, saw potential in me even when I was getting discouraged. And this was something that Ruskin obviously saw in people like Henry Swan and George Allen. And I think those stories remain as moving as some of the stories of the working people that Ruskin inspired. I've become very fond of Ruskin's triad of Preconditions for Happiness at Work, which he wrote about in a pamphlet in 1851. For workers to be happy, he said, these three things are needed. They must be fit for it, they must not do too much of it, and they must have a sense of success in it. And not coincidentally, these are the same three things with different words that modern management writers who do look at happiness, and there are a few, focus on. So Dan Pink, very well-known business writer, describes these in his book Drive as the equivalent of mastery, autonomy, and purpose. And I think these also could be pillars for the Guild's work and our work collectively in this area of economic justice. So first of all, fitness. This is obviously links back to the education, the training, the development, the apprenticeships, and indeed the very basic work that WMC is doing that starts people on the route to mastery. Rachel Dickinson alerted me via Twitter the other day that the Social Market Foundation has recently, a think tank, has recently proposed a plan to introduce titles for advanced craft skills. So their suggestion is that you might rise up a ranking to become a master craftsman or craftswoman. And that made me unavoidably think of Sheffield's Little Mesters, which are celebrated downstairs in the work of this exhibition. The master craftspeople who did a lot of the cutlery and silver work, which became emblematic of what Sheffield had to offer the world. So the second pillar would be they must not do too much of it. I think that's an objective we can all agree with, whatever our work is. But it's not that I'm suggesting that the Guild should back some kind of slackers charter for workers. I think there is a very strong link between that very simple way of putting it, they must not do too much of it, and some of the challenges that modern work faces in regulating, for example, the hours of workers, something I wrote about in my column for the Financial Times this week. Chinese technology workers are objecting and protesting at some risk, because obviously a political protest is not welcome in China, about the hours that they work. They are saying they've set up a page on a collaborative coding site called 996.icu, 996 being the 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6-day-a-week shift that they say they are encouraged to work, and ICU obviously being the intensive care unit where you will end up if you work too many 996 shifts. But this got me thinking about the history of regulation of work, and it seems to me that there is really a case for some new thinking about how we determine that independent workers particularly are not going to be driven into an obligation to work all the hours that were available. As we know from the Victorian era, right at the beginning of the 19th century, enlightened mill owners like Robert Owen started to think about how you divided the 24-hour day and how you prevented workers from becoming burnt out. And I think there is a new call for that kind of combination of regulation and humane management of work, and particularly, in fact, of some way of thinking about oversight of the growing gig economy. So the gig economy, as you know, is the is the ability of people to exercise their skills in smaller chunks during the day, where it offers a modicum of freedom to some people to work when they want to and not work when they don't want to. But it also, one person's freedom to decide where and when they work is also another's enslavement to an algorithm or a determination to work because they see that just one more hour will be able to pay the bills. And I think Ruskin's preoccupations in his day with the excesses of parts of the economy, mainly industrial and manufacturing, that he saw would, if he were alive today, be transferred to these bottom-of-the-rung jobs that the WMC is educating people to occupy as the first step towards mastery. The Deliveroo couriers, the baristas, the cleaners, the Uber drivers, and indeed, when I went to Ruskin, Florida, that's where this mural is found, commemorating Ruskin, whose ideals inspired the community when it was set up in 1908, somebody told me that actually if Ruskin were to come to Florida, a bizarre thought, but then you never know, that he would probably be as interested in protecting the itinerant tomato pickers of Ruskin, Florida, as he would be in challenging the overdevelopment of the area today. I think he'd also be concerned for the creative, productive role of workers like those at the Unto This Last workshop, and for others who are seeking ways to coexist with increasingly advanced machinery. And this is another area, I think, where some thought could be put into making my sense that the best approach to work in future will be some coexistence, be more than just wishful thinking, and to prevent the possibility that capital owners, those who see the value of buying more machines and having fewer human beings in the workplace, don't simply go the whole way towards abolishing the important human input that is necessary to bring that creativity and imagination to production. The third part is obviously the sense of success, which is my favourite bit, because it seems to me we often think about happiness at work being due to some perfection, to take the word that Ruskin didn't like, some perfection of outcome, that we're going to end the day feeling that we have fully achieved everything. And anybody who has done any job knows that this is an impossibility. Indeed, there is some evidence that trying to achieve total fulfillment through work is actually bad for your health. So this idea that that the sense of success can be given to people at work is, I think, a very profound and useful one. And I can see a role for the Guild in the same way that it currently backs, for example, or has backed the Ruskin Prize in art, to recognising and rewarding people who do achieve mastery in crafts widely defined. How about a Guild Master Craftsperson of the Year, for example? And also for highlighting and promoting good practice in the workplace, not just a best place to work, which is an accolade that already exists in a ranking, but a happiest place to work. In other words, giving some recognition to the places that, according to John Ruskin's own terms, on his own terms, ought to produce the best work as a byproduct of workers' own happiness and sense of success. So a final, just leave you with that little advert for my book, and that is just a provocation, I hope, for you to ask or interact or open discussion on any aspect of what I've talked about, and indeed some of the things on economic justice that I perhaps just touched on in order to concentrate on work. Thank you very much. Yes, John. Microphone coming.
While the microphone's coming round, if you could introduce yourself, just say who you are, that would be really helpful, because we get to know each other through the day today. And then say your observations.
Okay, I'll stand up because I'm very short as well, so you won't know who I am. I'm John Isles. I'm from the Guild's farm, Unclis Farm, in the middle of the Wyre Forest, where I try and be a farmer and a forester. Andrew, really interested in what you had to say there. I'm just wondering about cultural differences between different nations. I've often sort of felt or been led to believe the French have a different approach to life generally, and work in particular. You get the idea of a cafe culture, a longer lunch break, going home at a sensible hour. how do we stand with the French, say, in terms of productivity, and what did you learn beyond what you shared with us there from Michelin?
Yes. Well, of course, the French are more productive than we are. The British are. So despite that perception, it's actually been, it's often repeated that the French could knock off on Thursday, perhaps they sometimes do, and still have produced more in the week than we do in 5 days of production. I quite like the cartoon that appeared in the FT once of two cliché French people, with all due respect to French people in the room, sitting in a cafe with glasses of red wine. They've got the berry and the stripy jumpers, and one saying to the other, "Just remind me, have we retired or are we on strike?" So, but I think there is a cultural difference. Clearly, a sense of the way in which work is done and why it is done. And this leads back to a lot of the things that I write about and think about with another hat on as chair of the Blueprint for Better Business, which is a charity looking at purpose in business. I think a sense of why we do what we do is there are cultural differences. So one of the things that concerns me about seems odd to be concerned about rising employment. Clearly, it is of huge value, as Ruskin recognized, that people have work. And indeed, although I think there are some little seeds of what is known as universal basic income in Ruskin's writing, particularly in Unto This Last, the idea of a payment made as a sort of safety net for everybody to compensate them for possibly jobs that can't be recovered from automation. I think Ruskin probably would have felt that didn't offer any meaning because work was not being done by people who were just simply taking a donation from the state. I lost my thread there. I think the element of cultural difference comes from thinking about why we work and the quality of the work. So more jobs is great, but better jobs are even better. And I think the better job part of this is the vital part to bear in mind as we think about it. It's worse in the United States, of course, where there is genuinely a hollowing out there of the types of jobs that are being done. Any other? Yeah.
Hello, my name's Robert Somerville. I run a craft business in rural Hertfordshire. My question, have you come across the place of volunteers in the workplace? In my experience, in my company, my business, on Thursdays it's a volunteer day, and people come to volunteer and have a great time. They get given lunch, good lunch, and they come with goodwill and at the end of the day, it's an amazing feeling of what we've achieved and so on. And it works very well. So I wondered if you have experience of that in other businesses or have thoughts about the future when potentially lots of people will have part of their jobs replaced by AI.
And how do you ensure that you're not, how can I put this, exploiting your volunteers?
Well, there's no money on the table, so they only come if they want to.
Right, but then at the same time, you might well be producing more as a result of their efforts. So do you not feel that there's any obligation then to give them more than just the sense of fulfillment that they get from helping out?
Yeah, I constantly ask them, why are you here? And apparently their friends think it's outrageous that they come and work for nothing. But it's partly because of circumstances. We don't work with machines, we just work with hand tools,
yes.
Which is, it's much easier to get job satisfaction if you're working with hand tools.
Yes.
So they enjoy it. It saves the client between £200 and £600 a day to have them there. So it works for the client.
I mean, the reason I ask is obviously that, I'm sure you're a benign employer of the most enlightened type. But clearly, in a lot of cases, you would find, I think, personally, I think we all do a lot of voluntary work at work already. I mean, I turn out for the FT to do things at weekends. I go and work, go to breakfasts and dinners. My day is probably a 996 in some some parts of the week. So there is an element of goodwill that I think, particularly in white-collar work, is essential to lubricating the economy. And I'm not saying that is necessarily a bad thing. I enjoy my work, so I'm happy to do more of it, and I want to be better at what I do, so I will devote time to it. But I think we begin to see in some of the discussion about, for example, internships, that the dangers of relying on people's voluntary input because they get something out of it need to be rather carefully thought about. And so I think in the case you're describing, it sounds as though you're enhancing what they in a way are getting in return is not just the fulfillment of doing it, but they're learning skills. In a way, your barter is you're training them in something to do with their hands, which possibly they might have paid for to go to a working men's college class or a woodwork class if they weren't volunteering for you. So there is a sort of trade there. My concern would be more that voluntary input, when it tips over into obligation, obviously they can then walk, at which point you're in trouble because you've suddenly got to find ways to fill the gap, but it needs to be rather carefully watched. So I don't want to sound over suspicious about it. It sounds like a wonderful thing. And
yeah, I mean,
in fact, where in Hertfordshire are you? Because I live in Hertfordshire. Maybe I should come and turn my hand in.
You'd be very, very welcome.
Yeah, where are you?
Near Welwyn Garden City.
Right. I'm in St Albans, so I'll drop by.
It surprised me because I've also worked in the southwest where I'd never dream of doing that. But presumably it's a wealthier part of the country and people have time on their hands. But one of the reasons that they like to do it is because we work outside and they spent their working lives in an office in front of a screen. And the youngest volunteer says even the creative arts like architecture, he was a graphic designer, and he's had enough of just being inside working in front of a computer, and he wanted to use his hands and be outside. And I think he's not just a one-off, that it's part of a movement of people wanting to use their hands and be in contact with nature, be immersed in nature, which is it's what I do in my business. So people are attracted to it, and they say, well, we just come and want to work for nothing. That's fine.
No, and in fact, when I was giving a similar talk in Bewdley, there was a gentleman, well, several presumably in the audience there, who volunteer at Ruskin land for similar reasons. I mean, in fact, there was a gentleman who said, very clearly, I'm giving back and I want to be outside and learning things. And so there is, I think it's a fascinating area to be, with my FT hat on, managing volunteers. I mean, I have been involved and am involved in a number of voluntary capacities. And, my question, chairing a committee, for example, or a governing body, was always, why are these people devoting this time? And once you've got people, I think the profound part of this is if people are able to, are willing to devote their time and energy and skill to something, whatever it might be, voluntarily, as a business owner or team leader or chief executive or somebody who is used to just paying people and incentivizing them to do things, it's quite an interesting thought experiment to reverse it and say, what would I have to do to make my team come voluntarily to work? What would I have to do differently in order to make my team willing to come and work with me as they do when they come and volunteer for your business or indeed for any charitable or voluntary endeavour?
I take your point about the internship, and I think that's more difficult, particularly younger people want to get started, and I wouldn't want to take advantage of that. But I think there's huge scope, and people want, particularly because the way people their working lives are inevitably computer-based, to find ways to get out of that often requires them to volunteer and do something for nothing.
Yes.
Because it's less productive, potentially, than a robot could do it.
And I think those hand skills, there is the famous Ruskin Triad, another famous triad of head, heart, and hand, and the ability to revive that lost skill of working with one's hands is extremely valuable, part of what I've written about in the book as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other input? Clive? A bit in trepidation about setting the course for the guild with the master sitting in the front row. It seems like a... sorry, Clive, the mic is on its way.
I suppose this would work, actually. Is this still switched off?
No, I think she'd have to do it. It's coming now. Coming down.
Thank you. Is this... yeah. I'm just thinking... was thinking about William Morris and thinking that William Morris was inspired by Ruskin's ideas, but Morris in the end decided that you had to change the system, and that we're in some ways locked into a system which makes it impossible for small businesses, or almost impossible for small businesses to follow the kinds of ideals we might favour. And I wonder what you think about that, whether you think he has a point, and furthermore, whether socialism is the only alternative to what we call capitalism.
Well, we're in the throes at the Financial Times of thinking about the sort of future of the company. I was at a breakfast before coming here, which was talking about the future of the corporation, which traditionally has been, I think, the vehicle for improving prosperity for more people in more places, but which clearly is to some degree broken as a way of improving wider prosperity, and has become, in lots of cases, a vehicle for enriching the people who own or indeed are at the top of those organisations. So I think whenever one examines that conundrum of the system, when we did so at the Financial Times, and you might say, well, it's the Financial Times, what would you expect? When we looked at the future of capitalism around the time I was discovering Ruskin, thanks to you in part, Clive, because you were the first person I called about Ruskin and economics. When we were looking at this in a series called The Future of Capitalism at the end of the financial crisis, or the first wave of the financial crisis, a lot of people concluded rather wetly, I thought, that in a sort of Churchillian way, it's the least worst system, it's the best system, it's the worst system other than all the others, a bit as Churchill said of democracy. And I thought that was a bit wet. I thought you really needed to address something more about the potential side effects of capitalism. Now, clearly I don't want to get into a lot of high politics here, but clearly there are strains, even if you remember, it seems like decades ago, when Theresa May was at first running to be leader of the Conservative Party, when it looked like it would be a race. Her opening shot was to do with how do we reform the company, how do we bring more worker input, what can we do to improve the way in which the corporation works. And somewhere, deep beneath reams and reams of Brexitery, presumably that idea still lives. Of course, the Socialist Labour Party end of it has become arguably more extreme since, so much more of a forced attempt to bring worker democracy onto boards, to appropriate part of the shares of listed companies for employees, and indeed to siphon off part of the dividend from those companies into government. Those are all the sort of extreme solutions. I think, what I'm thinking about this is that, in some ways we have to work with the grain of what exists, but one can push some of the elements of the existing system that are beginning to see the necessity for change further in the right direction. To give a quick example, within the last week, in the United States, as many of you will be aware, the idea of sort of putting purpose at the top of company priorities, social purpose in particular, is anathema to lots of companies and company heads. But in the last week, we've seen Ray Dalio, who runs a big private equity fund called Bridgewater, and Jamie Dimon, who is the head of JP Morgan Chase, the bank, both come out in public statements saying that the system is broken in some way, that we need to fix it, that there are things that need to be done about social inequality, that the US is suffering in particular from some of the things that have happened. Now, first reaction may well be cynicism. They're pulling the ladder up behind them, they've made all their money, they're not going to change the way the system works. But, that is, in US terms, quite a big step to take, to put your head above the parapet, because in the US, the parapet is much lower. I think those are signs that arguably one should encourage, or at least applaud and say, go further, turn your company into a lobbying power for change, rather than a lobbying power for protection of what the company is doing. So, sorry, I rambled off there onto the...
Well, I just want to add a point. I'm sympathetic to what you just said, but one of the things that strikes me is that our economic system has been in crisis for something like 11 years, and nobody seems to have come up with a large alternative to the way we run things. I mean, you mentioned Theresa May. Somebody wrote to me from America when she made that speech saying, has she been reading Ruskin?
Yeah. Unlikely, I think, but anyway. Who knows?
But there's been absolutely no sign of any of that being put into effect as far as I can see.
Yeah,
So
well, I mean...
It seems as if the system has become totally inflexible.
Well, I think that I would have been surprised if you told me when I wrote first about Ruskin that we would still be talking about these issues now. I would have said either at that point the shock had been so great that change was bound to happen, or that the system would have flexed back to be exactly how it was before. I don't think either of those has happened, actually. I mean, there hasn't been the great change, and you might say a once-in-a-century crisis. If it can't happen then, when will it ever happen? And yet, the debate is still open. I mean, what I find a little depressing about both the Conservative and Labour proposals for change is that they do sort of hark back to, let's try something that worked in the 70s or 80s. Somebody told me that they felt that the Labour programme was very much, Sweden in the 1980s. So they're not necessarily thinking of new ways to change. It's kind of what can we pick from the shelf of the old ideas that seem to be around and just never got implemented here. So nationalisation, the worker board proposal, which has its merits, but not something that is necessarily going to significantly change the system if you look at how it works elsewhere. So you're right, to a certain degree, there needs to be something more radical done. But that meets resistance. We did an FT event in the city, and with an audience mainly of bankers and finance. And the question was posed to the audience: who here believes that radical change is necessary for the corporation? And I put up my hand, and so did two other people out of an audience of 80. Yeah. I then asked the same question at an event in Oxford on Thursday night last week. And everybody in the audience put up their hand. So, there's a difference there between the bien-pensant Oxford audience and the red in tooth and claw city audience. But there is a debate that I think is still live there, which is, for me, a cause for optimism, because I think while things are live, you can shape them, and that maybe is something we can do.
Thanks very much. Chris Baines, I don't want to steal my own thunder from this afternoon, but I spent last Friday evening in a public meeting in North Wales in the Conwy Valley, and I'm very struck by some of the kind of connections with what you've just been talking about. The Conwy Valley has just suffered possibly its worst flooding in 60 or 70 years. And once I got there, this was from Storm Gareth, and once I got past the point of suggesting that they should be careful what they wish for in North Wales, this is the first Welsh name for a storm that they've had, and it's kind of washed most of the Conwy Valley away. But what was really striking about the meeting, there were a number of things, but 150 people came in a small village in the middle of the valley, every one of whom was directly affected by the storm in one way or another. And as the evening wore on, fortunately, what they saw as the main culprit, which was the government agency who had designed and implemented the flood defence scheme, which had clearly malfunctioned on a spectacular scale. Had they been there, it would have been a very different meeting. But as they weren't there, it was a very conversational kind of couple of hours. And the thing that was really striking was the scale of the kind of insoluble aspects of this. What the hell do you do about climate change? What the hell do you do about the perfect storm of a very high tide and a torrential downpour meeting in their village? The next thing that became very clear was that there was an extraordinary level of local knowledge. I say extraordinary, probably typical, actually. And it was very, very precise. And it demonstrated two things to me. One was that if you could tap into that comprehensive knowledge of the place, you had a key to how to solve some of the local flooding problem. But also that all of these people were waiting for the system to address the issue because they'd been disenfranchised, if you like. And the thing that really, the example that just to illustrate it is that there's a railway line that runs up and down the Conwy Valley, which it was very clear had become a dam. And so many of the properties that were flooded because the stormwater had got on the wrong side of the railway and then couldn't drain away. And individual after individual was describing a particular culvert underneath the railway that they had been complaining about for years that had silted up and got blocked. And I just sat there, and I've been sitting here now thinking, we have to change a system to allow for that very specific local knowledge to be translated into local action. Because while these people are waiting for Natural Resources Wales, as it is in Wales, or the Environment Agency, to actually deliver their big solutions to big problems, nothing really changes. And in fact, things get worse. So I think, just to go back to Clive's point, there is maybe a role here for the Guild in actually finding a model which just re-empowers people to work at that local knowledge level, often with their hands or a shovel, so that the big problems can be addressed by the big players. But so many of the big responses in the landscape particularly are made up of a whole series of small problems which accumulate. And that particular example is just a classic one. And nothing they do will solve the problem of climate change in their valley or of the perfect storm. But many of the things they do would help to protect their individual properties if you get that kind of set of circumstances again.
Yes.
So it seems to me there's something really obstructive about the way that society now is operating. And the irony of the situation there is that actually they're all depending on the insurance industry, the government agencies, the water company, and a few other huge players, none of whom have the resources to actually address the issue anymore.
Yes.
So it's not just an inadequate system, it's a declining system which they're still dependent on.
Yes, and also, I mean, to add to that, I guess one might wonder just how many more generations would bother acquiring the local knowledge if they felt that they were dependent on a bigger system that was never going to change. I mean, I think you're right in a way, linking back to what I'm saying about the responsabilisation at Michelin and other examples of companies that are trying to make as it were, the grassroots solve the problems because they know that that is where the knowledge is. There's a parallel there, I think. I'm conscious, as Clive's pointed out, that in a way what I'm describing is working within the existing system. So Michelin, to take that example, which I know well, draws the line at having them decide what the strategy should be for the whole company. Or even, I posed the question when I visited Le Puy, which produces a particularly large type of tyre for agricultural and industrial use, but not the largest in the Michelin family, which is produced, I think, in Canada. I said, well, what if the workforce decided, we have the capacity to produce that very large tyre better than the Canadians do, bring it here? And the answer was very clearly, well, they wouldn't be able to decide that. So there is if one were being super radical about this, and I was conscious as I was preparing the talk that there would be a legitimate challenge that says, if we're interested in economic justice, we need to change something much more ambitiously than just the way in which we all work. But I think your point suggests that there is potentially some way in which one can meet between the two that allows people to rediscover their own agency, if you like, at the grassroots and enact some change that is then good for them and the communities and in this case the businesses where they work. I hope I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about that. Yeah, there's a couple at the front.
Hi, my name is Michael Robertson. I'm particularly interested in William Morris, and we all know about Morris's socialism. What did Ruskin say about socialism?
Well, I might defer to other people more knowledgeable in the room, but I mean, my interpretation of the Morris-Ruskin relationship was mutual respect. I think where Morris took what Ruskin had inspired would have probably appalled Ruskin somewhat. I mean, I think he would have felt that was going too far. But of course, he was, as Clive hinted, dependent in lots of ways on people who had more of the sort of practical action-based skills that could carry forward his ideas in different places. And this is the great thing, I think, about the Guild. People like me talk and write, but there are lots of people actually doing stuff with their hands and in communities who are carrying forward Ruskin's ideas. I mean, I think, as far as socialism was concerned, I mean, he did describe himself as a violent communist as well as a violent Tory, meaning communist, I think, deferring to Clive here, in a pre-communist with a capital C, pre-Marxist even. And I don't think he read Marx, although Morris clearly did and was one of the first to read Marx. So in a sense, he was sort of making it up as he went along. It's quite difficult to actually, for me, to think about what he thought about socialism when actually he was thinking socialistic, if that's a word, ideas before a name had even been given to it. So I think, interestingly, in the last chapter of my book, I go to Ruskin, Florida, and I ask them what they think. And that is the picture of the mural of Ruskin and the founders of Ruskin, the community in Florida, done on the 100th anniversary. But that's when it was first done. And since then, it has deteriorated a bit, and poor old Ruskin's mouth has been sort of scratched off or fallen off, and it looks a bit less well painted now. And there was one of the first things I was told when I went there was, oh, that's because people think he's a socialist. They've attacked it. They vandalized it because he was a socialist. And in fact, there's a line from the former police chief there, which comes from a video in which he said, Major Ronald Hartley says, Ruskin was basically a socialist. And this was going to be a utopia here, and everybody was going to all get along and sing Kumbaya and hang around and eat s'mores, that's marshmallows, by the fire and stuff. That's how Ruskin, Florida, got started. So there's this very strong idea that he was some kind of radical lefty, which of course is anathema to the slightly conservative-leaning McMansion owners of modern Ruskin, Florida, but which amounts to as much of a misinterpretation of Ruskin, I think, as the other extreme, saying that he was just a violent Tory. So, I think there's a sort of mixed and contradictory sense that one has of Ruskin working in the world and socialists drawing on him. I was a bit appalled to discover that none of the Labour Party members who I spoke to really felt there was much Ruskinian hinterland to the Labour Party, which was a surprise. And in fact, the most frequent quotations in Hansard in modern times in this Parliament about Ruskin come from a Conservative. So the Labour Party has, I think, slightly lost touch with that link. Any other thoughts? How are we doing for time, Chris?
We're doing fine. We've got probably another 10 minutes or so to go.
Yeah.
So.
Hi, my name is Hugh Hobbs. I'm from the William Morris Society in Hammersmith. I just wondered what Ruskin had to say about productivity, because you spoke quite a lot about productivity.
Yes.
But I was I was wondering in my head, actually, isn't the joy in work and craft work and the kind of ethic of work that Ruskin was talking about not really in keeping with necessarily productivity and just the purpose of being efficient?
Yes.
In the contemporary economy seems to be opposing what Ruskin was getting at, maybe.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in fact, it's one that Olivier Geoffroy addressed when I spoke to him. He genuinely thinks that productivity is the word that he would apply for using Ruskin's legacy. But you're quite right. It has become associated with ever more efficient ways of doing things, how to kind of get more from the same group of workers. It's at odds with the ideas that I mentioned of sort of having more slack in the system, more latitude. I mean, I like to think that there is an enlightened view that says, actually, if we give workers more time, they will actually be more productive and happier, so that the two things are not mutually exclusive. But clearly the kind of drive to match British productivity with that of the French or German equivalent workers is seen from the top down as essentially an economic project where human happiness doesn't really enter literally into the equation for productivity. But I mean, I did a piece for the Financial Times last year about productivity and the role of management in making work more, organisations more productive. And quite a lot of the discussion there, which is why I mentioned this sort of humane management point, comes down to, are there ways in which we can work with our workforce to train them better, to make them better at their jobs, to cut down waste, some of the things that Unto This last workshop is trying to do, in order to be more productive without simply making it, let's squeeze more juice out of the orange. But you're quite right to identify that there's a contradiction there. I suspect Ruskin would have felt productivity was entirely to do with not manufacturing souls of a good quality, but actually producing more stuff. And there's lots and lots of his writing that talks about that, and of course links it back to, as we'll hear later, pollution and ILF in its wider form as a despoliation of nature. So it's a fair challenge, I think, to say, well, does productivity just lead to cranking the machine with the human in it faster, or can it be linked in some way to producing more happiness at work? One of the statistics that I used in my column this week about working hours was some research that Berkeley professor Morten Hansen has done, who did a long piece of research with 5,000 workers, discovering that you get diminishing returns over 40 hours a week worked. Up to 50, up to 60, the improvements in the amount that they produce level off, and above 65 hours a week, they actually decline. So, the element of productivity that says, we need to be hitting some sort of sweet spot here doesn't actually involve driving the worker ever faster. It actually involves stepping back and saying, can we work smarter and better? I'll take one from somebody who hasn't and then come back to you, John.
The other dilemma which I see is related to the previous speaker's question was when you make something by hand in a sort of craft-like manner, often it ends up being, if it's sold, it ends up being a product for somebody who's obviously got enough money to pay for it.
Yes.
Yeah? So I'm a knitter, so if I knit my own jumpers, I would never sell them because I'd have to charge far too much money and nobody would want to buy them for the amount of hours I put in. Kind of think that argument. But I wonder whether you see also in the future, my future, or the future I see ahead of me, is, and the way that I see Ruskin being relevant to an awful lot more people out there, is this idea of, we all recognise that the world is going to change. The systemic problem, everyone sees that it can't last very long. There's a whole movement of people who are interested in craft and doing things for themselves, getting some agency back, making things. Do we have to sell the products? Can we make things more for ourselves? and share things and make things in communities? And could the Guild of St George get more involved in that aspect? So it's not really a monetary thing, not really a financial thing,
Yes.
not really a sort of proper work, for want of a
Yes.
better word, but more in communities. This idea of resilience, having to build up our resilience, because things are going to go, you know, can't think of another way of, but, you know, hitting the fan, sorry, can't think of another way of saying that, but they will do. They're bound to. We live on a finite planet. And it's not very far in the future anymore. So this idea of craft and getting communities together to make things of beauty, this is how I see Ruskin relevant today. And I wondered whether you see that as do you share that as well?
You should meet William Morris. I mean, that was a dilemma that Morris faced, and indeed the very first economic symposium that Clive and others got me involved with for the Guild, I remember that point being raised, I think by Howard Hull from Brantwood, about the arts and crafts movement. But, you know, they were struck by this dilemma that actually in the end, although they wanted to make useful and beautiful things for ordinary homes, a lot of it ended up being bought by people like my great-grandfather, who was a wealthy merchant who could afford arts and crafts stuff. So there's that is a dilemma. But your second point about resilience, I think, is a good one. I mean, I think there is those of us who haven't worked with our hands for a while, you know, who hasn't thought, actually, you know, if the electricity went off and I couldn't actually just Deliveroo my lunch to myself, you know, would I be capable of coping with the apocalypse? And that's a worrying thought, but it's obviously one that leads to the sort of community group that Ruskin himself would have encouraged in the Lake District in the latter part of his life. None of those ventures really scaled up, and most of them didn't last very long. But they were, in a sense, building craft skills. They were selling them, I think I'm right in saying. I don't think it was any necessarily a handing round of the things they'd knitted or spun. There was an economic end to what they were doing, but there was a sort of resilience there of use of hands. Interestingly, Under This Last workshop is partly built on the idea that by becoming more productive and reducing waste and working with machines, they will be able to produce useful things, tables, chairs, and other furniture, at a price that is reasonable. And because they stay local and they don't attempt to work with a massive and expensive and potentially risky supply chain, they will be able to provide useful and, in modern terms, beautiful things for homes, ordinary homes, rather than pricing themselves out. When I last went there, Olivier Geoffroy was experimenting with a sort of lacquered finish using farrow and ball paints for some of the wood. They work with a sort of plywood base, and so they were painting them, but he was struggling with the idea that in order to give it this lacquered finish, which FT readers would love to have in their bespoke dining rooms and so on, they would find themselves pricing themselves beyond the point at which it was worth doing. So there's a sort of moral point that I think is quite Ruskinian in the way in which Until This Last and workshops like it think about their work. John, you had one.
I was going to slide in quickly next and then deliver the mic. I'm Rachel Dickinson, and I'm one of the directors of the Guild of St. George. And what you said really resonated for me, because I'm somebody who came to Ruskin largely through being inspired by what he has to say about things like taking up spinning and learning to do things with your hands. And so I knit, I spin, and my solution to what you've mentioned is really turning to what Ruskin says. And Ruskin says, if you can make and can afford to give it away, give it away. So I spin and then I give my yarns to people who knit or weave to do what they want to do with them. If you can afford to hire other people to do it for you, and so buy the fibers from other people ethically, and if you need it for your income, find people around you who are willing to pay the money that's necessary for you to be able to make an income from doing it. So Ruskin sort of offers answers across the spectrum of that, depending on who you are and what your needs are. And on that note, I'll hand it over to John.
Thanks, Rachel.
Oh, thanks so much for having a second start. Fascinating conversation, Andrew. I was going to ask you about quality circles and the Japanese experiments and things like that, but I'm not. I'm going to give you a word of encouragement, really. We talked about resilience. One of the things that's coming around the country, and we've got a little open example in Bewdley, is the transition movement, with people sort of saying, look, we're past peak oil, we've actually got to start living and, you know, growing vegetables and goodness knows what else for the future. And one of the things we've got going, which is working really well, is called a repair cafe, which happens once a month, where people bring things that they can't fix, and a team of us fix it. So it stops things going into landfill. Linda does sewing and gluing and sticking, even helping people, teaching them how to sew on a button so that, you know, a pair of trousers can be worn again. And there's quite a number of these now around the country. And it's leading to a call around the world to make things that can be repaired rather than have to be thrown away. Because most of the stuff we get, like things like digital alarm clocks, you spend most of the time finding a way of getting into the thing, and then it needs a 40 pence capacitor replacing, and it's absolutely fine, you know. So I think there's something to be said about the Guild reflecting on and looking at things like the transition movement, seeing how we can align ourselves to that and even encourage it further. I don't know if you've come across it yourself, Andrew.
No, I haven't. That's a great idea. I read a column a while back about make, do and mend, and how we'd lost the kind of capacity to do that. It was slightly sort of tongue-in-cheek at the idea that we were going to be heading into difficult times, but, you know, over a period, I think if people realise, I think because we, economically, just to sort of sum it up, I suppose we have built a society and an economy that is very much based on the fact that if you buy more, that buying more is the way to demonstrate that you are an active member of that economy. And I think maybe there are younger generations that are rethinking that already in terms of both the economic and environmental consequences of what they're doing. And that might well be something that would catch on rather than being, oh, this is, you know, something that my great-grandparents used to do when they needed to kind of repurpose a pair of trousers or keep something going for longer. It becomes a badge of honour now to say you've got vintage clothing or you've rebought, and perhaps it'll become repairing. Repairing will be the new buying. I'm trying to think of a good slogan for this, but yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chris. Thank you.